Welcome all and thank you for coming. I'm Sharon Report and I work on state homeless policy for the Corporation for Supportive Housing. CSH is a national nonprofit and community development financial institution. So you are attending a session on creating housing for people experiencing homelessness using national housing trust funds. When we first drafted this proposed session, we were anticipating that the Build Back Better Act, which we at that time all thought would pass, would include over $1 billion for California for National Housing Trust Funds. Since passage of Build Back Better is looking pretty unlikely at this point, we decided as panelists to expand the session description a little bit to include some discussion around other sources of funding, though our focus will be largely still on the National Housing Trust Fund. I also wanted to mention that our panel wants a conversational tone to this session, and so we are encouraging all of you to ask questions and make comments. To do that, you would just go into the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of your screen, and you would just click on that and then type in your question and submit. So again, throughout the session, feel free to just post comments or questions, and that will make the session much more lively. We're also going to be asking questions of each other, and we're going to have each of the panelists do like a brief overview of their perspective, and then we'll launch into the questions of each other. And again, we'll intersperse those questions and comments with questions and comments from you. So let's start with a round of introductions of who's on the panel. We'll go to Jeffrey Ross first.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. I'm Jeffrey Ross. I'm the Deputy Director for the Division of Federal Financial Assistance at the California Department of Housing and Community Development, and looking forward to the conversation today. So Sharon, I'll pass it back to you.
Thank you. Lisa Engel.
Hi, I'm Lisa Engel. I'm the Chief Consultant to the Assembly Housing Committee. It's great to see all of you today.
Thanks, Lisa. And Dora.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dora Leon Gallo. I'm the President and CEO of a nonprofit based out of Los Angeles called the Community of Friends. We're a supportive housing developer, and we were started doing this work in 1988.
Thanks so much. So we are going to start with each of our panelists talking about current opportunities to build housing for people experiencing homelessness with housing trust funds. And I'll first turn it over to Lisa.
So I was going to give a little bit of background on AB 816, which is a bill that my former boss, David Chu, carried last year. The story of the bill starts in 2017 with another bill, AB 74. AB 74 created a program called Housing for a Healthy California. And the program was designed to fund supportive housing for people who are chronically homeless who are also receiving some sort of Medi-Cal services or funding. So we created the program. We ran the bill and tried to get some general fund money. And at the time, the Governor Jerry Brown was not really interested in investing general fund money into housing. And so Sharon and Corporation for Supportive Housing were the sponsor of the bill and came up with a creative idea to use National Housing Trust Fund money for the program. And the National Housing Trust Fund money has to be dedicated or focused on people who are extremely low income or low income. So we dedicated 3 years of National Housing Trust Fund money to Housing for a Healthy California. That authority expired last year. So in looking for a way to continue the program, we started talking with HCD about different options, decided that it really didn't make sense to continue the program as a standalone program because we're all trying to consolidate our different programs to make it easier for developers to apply. So we looked at how we could funnel the National Housing Trust Fund money into or prioritize projects that for people who are experiencing homelessness, who are also receiving some kind of Medi-Cal services. So what the bill ultimately did was direct HCD, when they receive the National Housing Trust Fund money, to direct that towards projects that are supportive housing and also serving people who are receiving some sort of Medi-Cal services, to the extent that those projects exist. So I guess big picture, that represents a pot of money that could potentially go towards projects that are supportive housing, serving people who are experiencing homelessness, who are also receiving some sort of Medi-Cal benefits.
Thank you, Lisa. And now I think it might be time to bring up our first poll. We wanted to poll the audience to ask you about your experience. And I think we wanted to find out, first off, who is among the audience, what your primary role is. So Dominic, could you bring up that poll around the last one that we submitted to you, the background? Thank you. So if everybody can just respond to this and we can get a sense of who's in the room, virtual and in person.
The last box is for other.
Right. Thank you. Looks like we do have a couple that don't fit into the other categories. Okay, so we're gonna end the poll. Please put in your responses if you haven't so far. Okay, so we have a good mix here, but it does look like most people either government agency staff or developers. Okay, thank you, everybody. So Jeffrey, I'm next going to turn it to you, and we'll be doing one other poll that has two different segments in it, but wanted to turn it to Jeffrey first, talk about his experience working with housing trust funds and what he sees as opportunities around housing for people experiencing homelessness.
Thanks, Sharon. So while we're not necessarily talking about Build Back Better and $1 billion coming to the program this year, I think it is important to note that there's still ample opportunities to really try and use the trust fund, to fill a much needed gap in the state and in our communities in terms of permanent supportive housing. Right now, this last year, we received just over $150 million in our annual allocation for the trust fund. And the trust fund is growing, which is great. And so, it's likely that we'll continue to see, a rise in the annual funding allocation. And so, 150 million, there's still a lot of opportunity for us to do work at that funding level. Likewise, we have a few other programs that have been made available through the American Recovery Act and also just, our other annual funding that comes to us. And so, one program that immediately comes to mind that helps support this population, in addition to the National Housing Trust Fund, is the Home ARP program. And as a state, we received, again, about $150 million in Home ARP. So if you just take those two programs right there, that's $300 million potentially that it can be really targeted to ELI populations. And ELI, we're really talking about 30% AMI and below. And yes, we can go up to 50, but we're really talking about that 30% AMI and below population. And as we know, the deeper you go into that population, the more wraparound services are really critical to support households and to keep them stable. And so that also lends itself to, we're talking very much the same population as what we see with our housing authorities and with the housing choice vouchers. And as part of the American Rescue Plan, we also saw, our housing authorities receive emergency vouchers this past year. And these are important sources. While emergency vouchers cannot be project-based like our traditional HCV voucher can, there's just not enough units in general for folks receiving vouchers. And so while you can't underwrite and necessarily get the same lending and other resource as a result of the project base, being able to plan for and accept vouchers into budget in a way that you can collect higher rent necessarily than what your underwriting would alone support is something that is important to be considering in terms of thinking about how to support these projects. And so bringing the housing authorities into these conversations is also critically important. And then we also have our annual home program, which I think also lends itself to really support the Housing Trust Fund and the emergency vouchers and HCV vouchers just in general. And we receive about 40 million a year in that. So between the National Housing Trust Fund and home just annually, that's 190, almost $200 million. Again, we have these one-time allocations available to us. So we're still talking about some pretty significant resource, even though Build Back Better has not come to fruition. And so we know, we just released as a department the statewide housing plan. We talked about that, we need 2.5 million housing units in general, but we also need a substantial amount of permanent supportive housing and housing that really reaches at this lower income population. And we know that to build all this, because we're coming out of a decade where we've built the least amount of housing as a country in the last 50 years. So there's a lot of work that we're trying to do to really prime the pump in terms of development. And so, the legislation that passed last year that Lisa was talking about was critical, because to the extent that a pipeline exists for PSH, we absolutely want to be supporting it, but we understand it's going to take a little bit of time, for us to, get that pipeline in place. So we can kind of ebb and flow based on what we're seeing in terms of projects between PSH and just, maybe lighter touch wraparound services for extremely low income households. So that's really kind of the current immediate opportunities that are in front of us with some of our federal resources. Of course, the state also has $2.75 billion in HomeKey funds that we're rapidly awarding this year and next year, that also is targeting this population and is really trying to make units available on a expedited fashion. Last year we created 6,000 units in less than 6 months, housed over 8,200 people. This year, there's already been close to $900 million awarded and 3,000 units now in the HomeKey 2.0 pipeline, and additional awards are happening. So it's a really, I think, exciting time to have this type of conversation and to talk about how we can continue to serve really the most vulnerable among us. And so I know we're going to have lots of questions and dialogue as we go forward, but really wanted to help frame what the opportunities are in this moment.
Thanks so much, Jeffrey. One quick clarifying question for you. For the emergency housing vouchers that housing authorities are getting, the reason why they can't be project-based is because they don't turn over, right? Once that household is done using it, then there won't be a voucher available for a different household. Is that correct?
That is correct. But one critical thing, right, is if we're targeting like we're supposed to, emergency housing vouchers are supposed to be for homeless and those at risk of homeless, really critically vulnerable population. Mm-hmm. The traditional HCV programs a lot of times see roughly around a voucher staying with a particular household for at least 10 years. So if we're targeting right, this is a voucher that even though it won't transition to another household when that household leaves the program, if we're targeting the right population, we're talking about a voucher that's going to stay in use for quite some time. And so that is an important aspect of the emergency voucher.
Okay, thank you very much, Jeffrey. Dora is going to be talking about some of the challenges with the Housing Trust Fund dollars.
Before I do that, I actually want to comment on the opportunity that Jeffrey raised about the emergency housing vouchers, is that while you can't convert them, it certainly becomes an opportunity for regular affordable housing, right? For to take advantage of housing people experiencing homelessness using those vouchers. Maybe someone who runs regular affordable housing have traditionally not rented to people who've experienced homelessness, but this is an opportunity to do that. And so, I mean, this panel is going to talk about a lot of other options and opportunities as well. I did want to, when we originally thought this was going to be focused primarily on the Housing Trust Fund, I had raised there is a challenge for those of us who do supportive housing in utilizing those funds. And it is essentially because it's tied to people who have very low incomes, 30% or below. You know, in many of our programs at the state and the local level, you know, we are essentially leveraging our resources, our operating subsidy to allow for deeper targeting and to secure a permanent loan. And one of the unique aspects about the Housing Trust Fund, appropriately targeted to very low income people, but they do it in such a way that there's no flexibility. And so most HCD programs allow a float up provision as an example. So if for some reason we lose our rental subsidy, it's not renewed after 15 years or whatever time period we have, we are allowed to raise our rents from 30% of AMI level to upwards of 50%. But the way the legislation is written, it doesn't allow for that. So, you know, when the program first started, community friends were very excited about it because we do serve people who are very low income, experience homelessness, and fit the criteria under which the Housing Trust Fund is really targeting. But when we looked at that, it became a financial feasibility issue. And it's still an opportunity because, like Jeffrey said, the state received $150 million last year. And that's because nationwide, over $600 and something million was allocated to the trust fund. When it first started in 2015 or 2016, only 174 million nationwide came out, right? And we got 8 million or something. And over the last few years, it went up to 200, 300 million nationwide. The last 2 years have jumped and went from 300 to 600 million nationwide. In 2021, I think, the allocation was 739 million, right? So it's only going up. And we know that our congressional representatives are very focused on the Housing Trust Fund as a conduit of moving funds forward. You know, we still count on home funds, but home funds have been steady at the low 3 billion nationwide rate for a long time, and it's not likely to increase anytime soon. So this Housing Trust Fund is the opportunity. So how do we make it work from a production standpoint and to allow us to secure additional funds by using it to secure permanent loans? And so that float up provision is pretty important. I do know other organizations, and you know, maybe this is the time to ask the question, Sharon, the polling about how many people actually have applied. I know people have, but I think those projects have been more in mixed income projects, or where it's projects that have differing levels of AMI. For people who primarily do supportive housing, like our organization, where you know easily 75 to 100% of our units are PSH, we need that float up provision to kind of get through our funders to allow us to raise the debt that we need. Do you want to?
Much. Yes, thank you. I appreciate that. I just wanted to put in or let everybody know about the chat from Willa Darley Chapin, and just, you know, giving further clarification to everything Dora just said with the National Housing Trust Funds, housing targeted to very low income households at or below 50% of AMI is allowed when the total annual allocation is $1 billion or below. The fiscal year 21 total allocation was 687. Fiscal year 22 will be 711 million, which means all Housing Trust Fund assisted units must be targeted at and affordable to households at 30% or below area median income. So just further addition to everything that Dora said.
But I want to add to that. So yeah, I was actually going to ask Jeffrey this question. So yes, it's true. when nationwide the trust fund is at less than 1 billion, then 100% of the resources must be targeted to people 30% AMI or below. Once that allocation, and we're reaching it, right? Like 700 million. Once it's over 1 billion, 25% of it could be for people at 50% of AMI. It's still 75% must be serving people at 30% of AMI. So my question to HCD is, do you think that, you know, the state, once we reach the 1 billion point, because I'm pretty confident we will the state change that, or will you still, because the state has the ability to keep everything at 75, targeting the entire pot of money at 30% of AMI or below. You don't have to go to 50%. So has there been conversations about that yet?
So I would say that, you know, this was the conversation we had around the legislation last year, where, you know, to the extent that the pipeline exists for PSH and to be at 30% and below, that's absolutely where we'll be. If there's not a pipeline and we're over the $1 billion threshold, but we can still develop important affordable units, then we would do that. So the legislation really allowed for that nuance. So because the other piece that we wanted to make sure that never became an issue was that we would have to give back these precious dollars because we didn't have the flexibility built into the program to expend them. And so I think that's the beauty of where we've come out. We learned a lot through HHC. These funds absolutely can serve and be an opportunity to serve folks with PSH, but we might not always have enough projects in that pipeline for all these funds to be used, and being able to eventually go up and serve a slightly different population so that these dollars still create really important units is something that we want to make sure, because if we don't have that, then whatever we're unable to allocate and spend, that goes back nationally and to the federal government. We want to avoid that.
Mm-hmm. I'm wondering if that language allows for FLOTA. You know, if you can serve, I'm just wondering, I don't know if I'm articulating it.
Yeah, I think your question is a good one, Dora, that if HCD set it at 30% but allowed for higher, for 50%, then if for some reason a community of friends or some other developer lost their subsidy, like let's say they were relying on those emergency housing vouchers and a household left that unit, then ACOF would be able to raise the rent on that unit to 50% because the state wouldn't be bound if we're at $1 billion or over of the national allocations. So I guess I just wonder, Jeffrey, if that seems a possibility. I mean, that might be too hard for you to answer at this point. But.
Yeah, I would say in this moment, I wouldn't want to say something that I couldn't, hold myself to. But I think
being
that it's
taped, you know.
Right, absolutely. But I think it's an important point, and I think that's why the housing vouchers, cross funding using other resources. These are all things that we know we have to be able to do with these projects to make them viable. And we're certainly committed to really try and understand, are there impediments, are there barriers, to making these funds work the way we need them, so that way we can actually produce the units that we know are necessary. So I think, first of all, we'll be super excited when we get over $1 billion and we can engage in this conversation and really understand what everything's looking like, because I think we're getting there. I will say a quick shout out to Willa. She is our section chief over the program. So she will say in the chat, if I misspeak, she'll hold me to it. So.
Great. Well, I think we're going to move into our, we've started a little bit of Q&A. We're going to move into our Q&A section, but first wanted to put up the next poll about whether anybody in the room or online has applied for housing, National Housing Trust Fund dollars through Housing for a Healthy California so far. So Dominic, could you throw up that poll, please? Thank you. So 2 questions here. Have you ever applied? And have you received? And it looks like the So far, the answer is no, but let's allow people to finish answering. We have one, yes. And then I don't know if anybody in the room can also answer that. Maybe I wonder, Jackie, if you could report back to us on whether anybody is raising their hands for whether they applied for National Housing Trust funds.
Hey, Sharon. I don't see anybody raising their hand in the room.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so it looks like we have one respondent who applied, but nobody received funding. And then a comment from Kristen Johnson. We have applied for Housing for a Healthy California in 2020, but the loan limits were really low at that time. Okay, thank you very much. Okay, well, that's helpful background for us to have as we proceed into the question and answer section. So I'm going to kick it off with the first question for Lisa. Are there opportunities to overcome some of the challenges that Dora raised?
Yeah.
The opportunities for that.
I mean, I think what we're trying to do in the legislature, and I think HTD is trying to do this as well, is create as much flexibility as possible. So when we worked on 816 and we're thinking about extending the Housing for a Healthy California program, the feedback was, let's make this an easier proposition for developers rather than having to apply for a separate program. We would align it with the National Housing Trust money. And the idea would be for that, I think when we talked with Jeffrey at the time, was to like make that funding sort of gap funding. So like to make projects work. And so there have been, last year we did funding in the accelerator fund, which was the first time we did that pot of money, which was intended to try and get the tax credit projects that apply for tax credits and could get them off the ground, like to create a flexible pot of money to try and get units going. So I do think like our focus and our discussions have been about how do we get the most number of units possible and create the greatest amount of flexibility. And I think that will continue. I'd also ask, and this may be a non-developer naive question, but if we are locked into 30% or below with the National Housing Trust Fund money, is there a way to do projects that are more mixed income so that you do have those like higher rents to offset the extremely low income? I mean, is that a strategy that we could incentivize or pursue that might maximize those funds? I guess I'll push it back to somebody, but
I think that's a question for Jeffrey and Dora.
Well, I mean, certainly I've been a part of projects that have financed and had different income targeting as part of them. There are programs that do that very well. I think that the nuances is what a developer thinks they can, be able to successfully pull together in terms of a project, how that project and those funding sources that are most likely available, how that fits the need of the population that they're trying to serve and the community they're trying to put the project into. So all of that really kind of comes into play. And then again, the other piece, and I appreciated the comment that the income limits or the loan limits were a little lower. We did adjust that. We saw that as well. And so I think that we're trying to make sure that this is truly a usable pot of funds that can be mixed with other resources, that whether it's vertical mixed income or horizontal mixed income, types of projects that to the extent that makes sense and it works for folks, that they can do that.
Yeah, I think in Jeffrey's other life, he was a developer because he hit all the topics. I mean, exactly right. It is very complicated to assemble financing from all these different funding sources, right? The state's made a big effort this week announcing the multifamily finance supernova and aligning definitions. Even definitions of what homelessness is different depending on what funding sources of the state that you're utilizing. So So that's marrying all the financing sources and then the needs of the tenants that you're actually serving. You know, we find that in some cases, especially the last few years, a lot of the resources have been focused on homelessness. And so as a result, you know, the loan limits might be higher, or you might be able to, you know, there might be some more flexibility with it. So it just ends up being the project being a higher percentage than what maybe we even intended as a housing developer and operator. And so mixing income levels is always a good idea, but the practicalities of using coordinated entry systems, sometimes you have to be watchful of the acuity levels that you're serving and who else is in the building. And so all of that comes into play. So it is a possibility. And we ourselves have, I don't know, 10, 15 mixed income buildings. But we're very careful about pulling the type of population that we're serving, the targeting, the location, you know, whether the services budget is healthy, whether the operation budget is healthy. All those considerations have to be made before we can decide, you know, whether we can mix.
Thanks, Dora. I wonder if you could say a little bit more about what you see as like the ideal funding source. What would that look like? And is that even out there right now?
So no, it's not out there because there's no one source. I think the ideal funding source is one source that gets us from completion to end, or maybe one pre-development source, one construction source, right? And one perm source. There's no such thing. I think so. All these various programs have different regulatory requirements, have different definitions, different compliance. Even when we do our lease up and our compliance matrix is sometimes it's very hard to kind of even understand in some cases what we've done to ourselves. You know, this AMI, 30%, 35, 40, 45, 50% AMI. And then you've got, you know, you're serving veterans, you're serving seniors, you're serving transitional age youth, right? So it's just putting that all together. So I would say definitely the number one criteria for a ideal funding source is one that's flexible. And I think, you know, both Jeffrey and Lisa understands that. So along those lines, I would say general fund, city general fund, county general fund, state general fund, but it's how we structure the program after the funding source. Because again, there's two things. There's the source itself, and then there's the program regulations, right? Because even with general funds, many jurisdictions will impose requirements on it that is unique to their jurisdiction, and then you try to mirror the state funding and it's different. The one source, I have to say, and we all know this, years ago that was flexible and was pretty ideal was the redevelopment agencies side funds. You know, it was pretty uniform throughout the entire state. Doesn't matter how many redevelopment agencies were operating their housing funds, it was very flexible and it was very helpful. So you heard the outcry when that went away. So that was kind of a long answer to a very short question, which, you know, no, there isn't one yet, but what the good thing is we are continuing to work on that, right? And as I mentioned, the supernova that came out, I mean, local jurisdictions doing that as well. You know, LA, where I'm from, is trying to align their funding sources, and having the state do one application where you can apply for 4 different programs at the same time, I think is going to help quite a bit. We all have to line it up to select and TCAC now, but the supernova is great. So we're working towards that.
Okay, thank you, Dora. Dora, I think you have the next question.
I could do that, but okay. So I think we skipped one for at least, so that's okay, but I can go first. Okay. So I made that comment about there's not one ideal funding source, but you know, for Lisa, perhaps, you know, working with this legislature, what other potential funding sources do you see that's coming up, that could potentially be coming up on the horizon for developers for whether it's affordable housing or supportive housing, but for people with experiencing homelessness?
Well, in light of the surplus this year, I think there is like a definite opportunity to spend some of our funds on one-time investments in existing programs like MHP or the Accelerator Fund. I think on the Assembly side, we're particularly interested in trying to put some money probably into those programs because MHP, the funding, I think this is right, and Jeffrey, correct me if I'm wrong, runs out next year. So we would do one big NOFA. We have the supernova at the end of this year, and then that would be it, I think. So I think we're all definitely mindful of, what's the next big thing? Is it a bond? There have been efforts that a lot of you have worked on over the years to try and create a permanent funding source, revenue source. My boss has a ACA this year. It's kind of a big, bold move to try and dedicate a percentage of the general fund towards housing, affordable housing funding and homelessness over the next 10 years. And so we would dedicate a percentage of the general fund thinking, we're going to have to spend this money anyway. So I think we're kind of at a crossroads to some extent. I think there's absolutely, interest in spending our general fund money this year and then thinking about, okay, what's the next step? How do we build out some ongoing funding? And then the governor's included funding in his budget in January for the Affordable Housing Sustainable Communities Program, which is not exactly, aligned with this discussion today, but it's, an indication he will spend general fund money on this. So that's not a definitive answer. I think the biggest thing I could say is there's a lot of interest in spending money on affordable housing and homelessness. And we have to pick which program this year we put the money in.
And my question next for you, Lisa, is very much along the same lines that we know we're running out of, no place like home, and we will run out of HomeKey money, of course, eventually. And as you mentioned, there's one supernova left for MHP for the money we have in there. So I guess in regards to potential for new money in this space, what is the discussion around just what Dora was talking about, the flexible source of money that could be used for people experiencing homelessness for either affordable or supportive housing, that use, what is the appetite to do something like that? Or is the appetite more to stick it into an existing program like No Place Like Home and focus on a population, specific program, specific population like Dora was talking about? So many of the programs are focused on specific populations. So
yeah, I do think the push in the legislature over the last couple of years, and in the AB 434 was the daily bill that directed HCD to create the supernova. Like, how do we align these programs? So I think that there is probably more interest in keeping that going, and how do we make this as easy as possible for developers, put the money into programs that exist, and how do we focus then on specific populations by creating more flexibility with the National Housing Trust Fund money or other ways that we can more deeply target it. I would love to hear thoughts on reflections on how well No Place Like Home worked. I feel like we've just started collecting data, I think in the last couple of years, about how program works. I think HCD did their first annual report maybe last year, and it indicated we didn't have a ton of units online. Now that could be, is that a function of that program? Is it that a function of, the challenges all supportive housing faces, and not having enough money for services, not having enough money for operating costs? To me, it's almost like we want to put this money into program and make it as flexible for developers as possible, but we also have to deal with some of the big elephants in the room that we haven't dealt with, which are service funding for services and operating costs. So I think we're evolving. I feel like it's getting better and better, but I don't know that we have the perfect program yet. Or maybe it's MHP with and the Accelerator Fund with some tweaks that make it more focused on supportive housing. Is that helpful?
yes, thank you. Okay, so maybe we should stop here just for a second and see if there are any questions or comments from anybody in the room. Jackie, do you see any hands up?
No, Sharon, I don't see any hands up.
Okay, all right, thank you, Jackie. Okay, so Lisa, I think you have the next question.
So this question is for Jeffrey. If federal funding is not coming, what is the universe of funding for building supportive housing from the feds? And I think you talked a little bit about this, but.
Yeah, it really, I think the programs right now most aligned are the Housing Trust Fund, Home, and the Home ARP program. And the Home ARP is a one-time funding source. But it's, you know, there's a little bit of pride here. That is the national version of HomeKey. That is what Home ARP is. And that's because we led last year, we continue to lead with trying to find a way to serve this highly vulnerable population and to unlock the variety of housing and ways that we can more quickly, you know, support folks. The challenge, I think, with all of our programs, and you know, the Housing Trust Fund specifically, the challenge is we're waiting for the final rule to come out for the National Housing Trust Fund. That's supposed to come out next year. And HUD, I think my development partners would know, would appreciate and you know, support this, that the COSA right now within the National Housing Trust Fund is more restrictive than what we allow in our state funding sources. And so that's a challenge. A lot of states actually do not even support COSAs. We're actually at a holding pattern right now. We've been struggling trying to get that to balance correctly, even though we've offered it. And so we're advocating, you know, with our fellow states and things like that to really try and get HUD to look at this. Again, flexibility is important. You know, folks have heard me talk in other conversations. It's important for us to know what we're trying to achieve, but we also need to be mindful how many different restrictions we put on things, because you know, if we're trying to meet multiple objectives at the expense of doing the thing that we're supposed to do, then that's a real challenge. And I think that's what HUD has got to really address in the coming year with the Housing Trust Fund and the way that they're looking at the COSR. So, you know, I think that hopefully, you know, we'll continue. The infrastructure package presents some opportunities as well here, because sometimes we can't build housing, we can't convert existing, you know, facilities to housing because the underlying infrastructure also isn't there, and that can be cost prohibitive if you don't get the housing money and the infrastructure money. So I think that, you know, looking at infrastructure, looking at some of the funding and the programming that's going to come out from the $1 trillion package for infrastructure is something that there's an opportunity there. How much that is, you know, I'm not sure yet. We're still on the front end of that piece, but that can be linked with housing. I think it's important, you know, for the last couple of years, and I think this is going to be going into the future. We're kind of hearing three objectives. We've got to deal with our homeless crisis. It's a travesty what we're seeing on our streets, right? We have to build more housing, and we have to address climate change, right? Like, so these are not mutually exclusive things. We've got to do them in tandem. So linking our transportation funding, our infrastructure funding with our housing and our supportive services, doing all these types of things and thinking of ways to create projects, but doing it where we're creating leverage that's flexible and not restrictive is what we've got to focus on. And so, you know, I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to continue to communicate with our federal partners. While we have very specific programs in place, you know, regulations can be changed easier than statute. At least I know you can appreciate that. And so, you know, I think that there's a lot of opportunities for us to continue to also think about how to use these different funds that are becoming available to us. There's quite a bit still in circulation and will remain in circulation for the next several years. And so I don't think we should be afraid to think creatively of how to bring all those together.
I'd like to ask a follow-up, because at some point I was going to bring up about the operating I guess, what do they call it? The operating costs that the trust fund can fund. And I would imagine that's what you're talking about when you say COSER. Can you talk about, because so California hasn't done anything with it. I heard like Oklahoma set something up. And so I didn't know, what are some of the restrictions? I know like a third, you can't use more than a third or something. What is it?
Yeah.
Say, yeah, if you can.
Yeah, so you can't use more than like a third, as you said, and like it doesn't pay for the management fee and stuff like that. So it is very restrictive. Like when we think of operating subsidies, we're thinking about management fees, we're thinking about operational supports and support services and things like that. And we don't have that same broad breadth of use for our operating subsidies using the National Housing Trust Fund. And so we've tried to make some of that available, but folks are needing it for things that are outside of currently what the rules that HUD has in place for those uses. And so that's a real challenge right now for us. And that's why, you hear me saying that we're going to be trying to communicate with HUD as they go through this final rule-making process. And quite honestly, I encourage everyone to participate in that, because they need to understand the obstacles in our way when we're trying to really serve extremely low-income individuals.
And so this is regulatory, not statutory.
Regulatory. So when they create the final rule,
Got it.
That's where a lot of this, because then it'll take a long time for them to reopen up that process. So they're going to go through public comment here in the next few months, and they'll be really working on that final rule. So really right now is going to be the time to make sure that HUD hears the limitations and the barriers that we're experiencing as we try to implement these dollars, so that way they really can get to their intended use.
Yeah, I learned very early. Is it statutory? Is it regulatory? Ask those two questions. Then you know the target, right? So, okay, thanks.
Jeffrey, is the 30% limit statutory, or is that also regulatory?
If Willa's still there, she can correct me, but I believe that is probably statutory, but I could be mistaken. So I'll wait and see what pops into the chat if she's still here.
Okay.
I brought it up to the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and they had said it was statutory. And
okay.
That's what our state statute aligns with, so.
I can see Willa is actually dropping into the chat right now. Some of those
Willa
uses.
did respond. 24 CFR 93.201. Operating costs eligible for National Housing Trust Fund money are limited to these 5 categories. But yeah, so the 30% limit is statutory, but I guess the 5 categories are regulatory: insurance, utilities, real property taxes, and maintenance and scheduled payments to reserve for replacement of major systems.
Right. So those are regulatory, because allowing the operating subsidy is statutory. So defining the operating subsidy is within the regulation, and that's why we want HUD to expand what they're going to allow. And it would be really nice if it matched the broader uses that we're all used to, because to what Dora was saying earlier, right, the more our programs match, the easier it is for the developers to cobble these funds together and actually produce the units.
Okay.
And I'm not so ready to back off too when it's statutory, because look at all the federal legislation that's been proposed to add money to the Housing Trust Fund, right? Build Back Better is an example. Senator Asfadia has another bill that came out that would add money to. So when they do that, they could put in their bill a little tweak, right? And so there's opportunities there. So
they could pass it as report language to an appropriation. That's true. Thank you very much, Willa. Like Kristen said, you're on it, so appreciate your response to Jeffrey's call out to you. We did get a question for you, Jeffrey, whether you can confirm after the just released AB 434 Supernova, will there be one more coming, or is that it?
So I think that's probably alluding to the MHP program. There's going to be one more coming. Right. I know the team is always looking at making sure all the dollars have been utilized and stuff like that. So if for some reason not all the dollars have been utilized, then we would follow up with another one, right? So there will be at least one more round. But the broader point is some of our current state funds are going to be coming to their natural end, and so we're like everyone, eager to kind of see where opportunities will be for us to continue to do this work.
Okay, thank you. Willa did post another clarification. The comment period for the proposed final National Housing Trust Fund rule has expired, but HCD did submit comments on this issue. So people cannot weigh in with, comments supporting HCD's comments. It's too late for that, it sounds like. But it's good to know that you guys were on top of it. So thank you for that.
Yeah, no, we try to make sure that we do that. And, unfortunately, I didn't catch that it already closed.
I wanted to ask a follow-up question to Jeffrey more about Project HomeKey, because I didn't mention that when we were thinking about like programs to put money in. But what are your reflections on that program as like a model that works? And did we take things from that program and incorporate them into the Supernova, like were there like lessons learned there, or is what makes that program so effective is the source of funds, that it's general fund and therefore more
So we're absolutely, Lisa, and thank you for the question. We're absolutely trying to take every lesson learned from HomeKey last year and apply that across the board to programs. And there were some great lessons learned in that. And that a lot of it has to do with how do we interact with our partners up and down the state, support them, make sure that we're really clear, so that way as applications come in, we're all seeing the same things and we can move much more quickly, reduce time, create certainty, which has impacts on project feasibility. We know that that's an important aspect. There are some uniqueness to HomeKey that made it incredibly successful. Land use conformance, most powerful tool I've seen in a program yet. I mean, I'm going to be honest. Of the 120 project consultations we did, I know I was a part of about 70 of those, and so got to hear from our partners up and down the state of what was going on, and land use conformance, environmental streamlining, always an important piece. But when we're talking federal dollars, I think there's an important nuance. We have NEPA and CEQA, and when we get CEQA streamlining, it does not carry over to NEPA. We still have to meet our National Environmental Policy Act requirements. And so Home ARP, why it is the national HomeKey model that's trying to mimic what we did, it doesn't come with land use conformance. It doesn't come with environmental streamlining from NEPA. So you have to be really cognizant on the front end of what type of project you're trying to do, where you're trying to do it, so you can minimize the impacts for environmental assessments and things like that. Because you always have to do your environmental. You can't do a thing if you haven't done your environmental. But you can plan appropriately and try and speed up that process so you don't get bogged down in it. And because time is money, and having clearer paths, creating certainty that reduce project costs, carrying costs, financing, all those types of things. So, those are all the lessons that HomeKey really hammered home, right? The fact that we could do a project up and down the state, didn't matter where we did it. It averaged $150,000 to $200,000 less per unit than our traditional programs. Lesson learned on speed and certainty, right? And so those are the types of things that we're trying to chip away at in a very meaningful manner across programs, federal or state.
Yeah, I actually had a follow-up also, Lisa. I was going to frame it exactly the way you had about HomeKey, but mine was actually a little bit more about what you saw in terms of the condition and the quality of the HomeKey projects, right? So we have yet to close on the HomeKey transaction, because when we are looking at motels that are available or even not available, we find that there's a fair number of rehab work that has to happen to make them a permanent home. Yes, buying hotels and motels, very quick way of getting people into housing, but it's not a long-term solution unless it's converted to permanent housing. And the way to convert it is to make sure they have their own kitchens. And then many of the hotels and motels, you have to convert them to have the community space also for the case managers. The property manager could have the leasing office, but you need room for the case managers You need community rooms that you can have groups and classes in with the people living there. And so I'm just wondering how many of these acquisitions will require substantial renovation to pull them into quality permanent supportive housing, and what that pull is on existing resources that might be needed later on that might hamper the continuation of the production of new housing.
So I would say under HomeKey 1.0, last year's model, about 45, 45, 10 is the way I would say it. So 45% of the projects were permanent housing right off the bat. About 45% or so were interim that will convert to permanent, right? They had to still spend a little bit more time to really figure out how to reposition that property. Because whether it started permanent or converts to permanent, 55-year use restriction, right? Like it has to stay in operation. 10% are going to stay as non-congregate shelter that really get at the ability to make sure that people aren't on the street, right? We all want to get to functional zero, but we still have to have infrastructure to support anyone that becomes homeless. And having a non-congregate site that addresses the individual needs of a person or a family or a household is a more responsive way to do that. And so, about 10% of last year's units will stay in that threshold. What we did see is that, we were using coronavirus relief funds last year, and they were set to expire on December 29th, and then they extended it. But we had spent all of our money by December 29th. And so we're like, well, that's great, you extended it, but that didn't help us. But the good part was we had 6,000 units and we got those things occupied very rapidly. But what we saw is that just like any project, you open up a wall, sometimes you find things you didn't anticipate. So we did allow for a little bit more time with the HomeKey 2.0 and a little bit more funding to address some of those pieces. We also added a year of operating subsidy to the program, because we know that these are important things, because a lot more projects now are coming in, and we're seeing it already with the initial awards coming in as permanent, which is great. There's still going to be some conversions to permanent, because positioning these as assets for the community and the individuals that we're trying to serve is foremost of what we want, because we want these to be really good models to minimize community opposition. Everyone always says they want to help the homeless, but I can't tell you how many public meetings I've been at where they say, I want to help them, but not here. Right?
I can tell you.
Yeah. And so we're really trying to minimize that aspect. And the other thing is in 1.0, even with the time that we did this in, we converted commercial space, we converted office space, we created brand new units using modular construction, we used manufactured housing, we did apartment acquisition and repositioning and rehab, and we did hotel conversions. We did every type of development there could be, and we did it in a very tight timeline. So HomeKey again showed that flexibility is critical, and being responsive to our communities, because we also did this with partners that had never operated a state program before. Local governments, cities, towns, counties that had not really participated in an HCD program, and our tribal partners. So that's the level of depth we need to be able to go. That's the flexibility that's critical, and the responsiveness that we need to maintain.
Just to follow up on that. Oh, go ahead, Dora.
I was just saying, it was very impressive. I mean, regardless of what there's always something we can improve upon, right? But the speed, like you said, and just how everyone pulled together, it was very impressive. And it gives people hope in working in the space that we can do this. We can build housing, and we can house people who have the need for affordable homes and provide those services. So it was very exciting, even though we didn't buy HomeKey, but we were very excited to see what was happening.
Okay, thank you. I was just going to follow up with a real quick question. Do you anticipate that some of those conversions are going to need rehab money from like tax credits or some other program that will kind of add to the cost of the HomeKey project?
Yeah, I mean, anytime you're going to go to conversion, right, it will increase some of the baseline costs that we're speaking to. With less conversions happening as a result of how we've structured HomeKey 2.0, we're going to be locking in that cost savings even more than what we did under 1.0. I think that the important part is that we're trying to balance the opportunity of a particular site, whether it's, already housing or hotel, or if it's a commercial. I mean, coming out of the pandemic, office and commercial space is going to be re-explored because it's going to look and feel a lot different going forward. And some of that is in some of the best real estate where it's high opportunity, and we would want to connect folks to services and amenities and things like that. But again, that's where the infrastructure conversation comes, because you can't just convert some of those buildings without going in the ground and upgrading utilities and doing some significant work there. So there's additional costs. There's different things that different sites will require, but that's built into the program, because the ability to use the housing now, or the space now, to serve people on the street so they're not on the street, and then figure out how to turn that into a real asset for the community that will be there for 55 years, that will serve 4 or 5 different households over its lifetime, really starts to get at what we're trying to do with these programs. And I think we can do that. These lessons can be implemented with our federal programs. Again, Home ARP is really kind of setting that groundwork, but I think it bleeds over to the Housing Trust Fund. It certainly can be applied, and we're looking to apply it to other programs within the state. The accelerator has been critical, right? Because we've been oversubscribed in tax credits and bonds and things like that. And so being able to push more dollars out, that projects were just waiting for that last bit of funding. These are all the things we need to do to supercharge development into our communities and really create the housing.
Thank you, Jeffrey. So I think just to get back on track with some of the questions we had planned, Lisa, I'll turn it over to you.
Yes, so this question is for Jeffrey and Dora. With MHP funding prioritizing projects that include a significant number of units dedicated to people with 30% and below of AMI, is MHP the program that will largely fund supportive housing? Does that open up opportunities to create affordable housing for people experiencing homelessness? Why or why not? So I guess, is MHP a way for us to create more units for people who are experiencing homelessness and are 30% of AMI or below?
I'm going to answer that really quickly and then turn over to Jeffrey, because he's the one administering the program. So from a developer's perspective, I think many of us do view MHP as the go-to program for supportive housing. I mean, that's not to say we don't appreciate the VHHP program, and I know I'm using a lot of acronyms, I'm sorry. But I assume people in this webinar know what we're talking about when we say VHHP and No Place Like Home, and except I never say NPLH. I always say No Place Like Home and VHHP. We look to those as new opportunities, but they're not like the mainstay. We always did view MHP as the program. And that's one reason, when UMRs come out, we do focus, again, I'm sorry, acronym, Uniform Multifamily Regulations come out, we do look at those regulations because in our eyes, those will stay, more so than some of the other programs. So from my perspective, that is where the resources go. And when there's new money available, right, I would imagine it would go into that particular program, but I don't know if Jeffrey views it the same way.
No, I think that's right. I mean, MHP is the backbone of what HCD provides. And, we got rid of the stacking prohibition this past year, in part because we know developers are looking to layer some of our, smaller programs with MHP. And, again, there's infrastructure components and things like that. So, no, I think that's absolutely right, because, it's not easy to assemble a project and finance it with one funding source. It can be done, but that is a challenge. And so I think absolutely, I mean, MHP has been the backbone and it continues to be the backbone.
Thank you for that. Will there be opportunities to combine housing trust funds with MHP? Do you anticipate, Jeffrey?
I mean, I think the opportunities already exist to do that. I mean, you can use it to create the mixed income housing that we were talking about earlier. You can use it to fill the gap and then be able to go after, tax credits or accelerator funding, things like that. So I think it already is a possibility, and folks are looking to do that type of stuff. I mean, Dora, you operate in the space.
Yeah, no, I think you can. Undergirding all of this too is the rental subsidies piece, which I think, Lisa, you alluded to, that services and the operations are also critically important. We used to say in the very early stages when we were explaining what permanent supportive housing is and how it works, is that it's a three-leg stool. You have your construction funding, you have to have your services funding, your operating funding, and no one entity who funds in those particular spaces will allow you to start construction until you have all three in hand. And if you only had two, your legs will fall, not your legs fall, your stool will fall down, you know what I mean? So you have to have all three, and the operating subsidy is always going to be the next concern that comes up. I do want to ask about the accelerator, if I can switch, the accelerator. Do you think the second round's going to clear out the backlog, or do you think there might be a need for a third? And, are there resources? So do you think there'll be a third, Jeffrey? And Lisa, do you think there'll be resources to do a third if we need to?
I mean, I know that the accelerator has been very popular. I do think that, it's going to be interesting to kind of see exactly where we come in. I haven't seen that yet. My counterpart, Jennifer, directly oversees the accelerator, so she would probably be able to speak to it a little bit better than myself. But it's been critically important to be able to get units that, but for the accelerator, are all ready to go, but have not, would not have the financing to advance.
I would say I do think that it has been popular and there has been a lot of interest. And I think what we've been talking about in sort of the assembly is how do we get units online quickly? So is that the solution? Is having that flexible pot of money the solution? How does that work with the timing of other, like as you said, if there are still projects that are backlogged, totally makes sense. If not, then are we pivoting to something different? Or is it, does it make sense to put in the accelerator fund? Do we go to MHP or some other pot of money? And then, but I do think it seems like it's been helpful to have that, again, that sort of gap funding to replace redevelopment or to replace, some of those sources.
Yeah, I mean, the accelerator essentially took the place of tax credits and bonds, right? Because we have a problem with the bond cap. And so because there's insufficient bonding capacity, we all got our funds from MHP or from, VIP and we're waiting to go through the bond process, and there's not enough funding. It's completely oversubscribed, and it didn't used to be, but it is now, and so we have to wait. So that's why there was this backlog. So, we're just wondering whether it's going to clear out enough so the program ends, or do we keep going? Because like you said, Lisa, there's just so many opportunities to move projects faster, and some projects will naturally go for the bonds and others will go for the accelerator. I mean, that would be really, really an opportunity to push projects faster, because we do have funds with MHP and IIG and VIP and all that.
The question is, how far are our bonds going to go? And if we continue to be oversubscribed, then it seems like we are going to continue to need that flexible pot of money.
So I want to take the opportunity to pause here and encourage people to put in questions in the Q&A. And I'll stop and see if there are any questions or comments from the in-person audience.
I don't see any person with their hand up.
Okay, thanks, Jackie. So I did have one last question, and then we'll end if we don't get any other questions from the audience. The last question has to do with operating subsidies. So I know we talked about this a little bit, but just wanted to get all of your take on where you see the potential opportunities for operating subsidies. I know there's some legislative proposals out there, but what do you all see as kind of the existing opportunities or potential opportunities in your case, Lisa, to move forward, legislatively, something for operating? So I'll start with Lisa. Did you want to start off?
So are we talking about operating subsidies or rental assistance or both, or is that the same thing? Would you
I
say?
think we're talking about mostly operating subsidies that can be used in a project for people experiencing homelessness. But I'm open to expanding that. So if you want to also talk about rental assistance, that would be great too.
I just asked because it seems like we have done operating assistance in the past by building it into like capitalizing the operating reserves. And that has been something that has been accepted by the administration, and like there's a comfort level with that. And I think that is something that I don't know that we have any standalone bills that deal specifically with creating a pot of money for operating costs, but I think like as we dedicate more funding to any one of these programs, I think there's support for that. I think the rental assistance piece is a little bit harder because it is an ongoing cost, and we've done some rental assistance programs, through like the CalWorks program or bringing families home, but I think they're all time limited, so there's limitations. But I would say there's generally support for continuing to doing operating subsidies.
So
Eric?
okay, I'm going next. So so right now, the No Place Like Home is the only program that allows a COSR, right? That will allow us to use the set aside funds for an operating subsidy, and even which is different, I think, Lisa, from the capitalized operating reserve, because we actually have both. In some, like if we have project-based rental subsidies, we frequently have to have a transition reserve or some sort of transition reserve, which quite honestly adds the cost of the project. And in some cases, it's kind of unnecessary. And I know we're talking about having 55-year covenants and knowing we have to keep our rents at 30% of AMI and below because we're serving people. And, we are pretty confident in the project-based program. The fact that the federal government allows local housing authorities to project-based 20% of their allocation, tenant-based allocation to project-based, and actually allows for a 10% waiver to go to 30%. The vast majority of public housing agencies in the country do not do that. Not only do they not reach the 20% cap, they don't even reach for the waiver to go to 30%. In Los Angeles County, Los Angeles City, the housing authority is beyond their 20%. They're in the 25, 26%. They're getting there. The county is nowhere at the 20%. And we still see very little project-based vouchers being put out a bit, being offered. And one reason is there's a high need for tenant-based. I understand that. But the other reason is the way HUD sets up their the rating system, I guess. They have this policy. Oh my God, I can't remember. There's this policy that they have, what is it called? Utilization rate. And for project-based, we get the allocation and it's 2 years before we can use it, and it hurts their rating. And so they don't want to do that. And so I think there's some work we could do legislatively, or I don't know if that's statutory or regulatory, but we need to do something to relieve housing authorities of that burden so that they would be more willing to. So I do think public housing authorities, there's a lot more opportunities there that they're not utilizing. And then how can the state help, right? How is, No Place Like Home helps. But I don't know of any other sources. And then, if you don't have, so the transition reserve is a whole different story, because I think it's too high. I have a project right now. I just finished looking at the audit. I have $2 million in sitting in reserves. To me, that's absolutely ridiculous. And they were capitalized. And it's like, why do I have that when I have a 15-year project-based contract? So, I mean, there's other ways we can use that money. I could have invested in 15 other units, right? So, but the other thing to go back to your point, Sharon, is that the Housing Trust Fund, Jeffrey, we were talking about maybe changing how they make that work to make operating subsidies work under the Housing Trust Fund. If we know that there's more federal resources coming to the trust fund over the next 3, 4, 5 years, that's one way of changing the regs to make it available for us to use to serve people experiencing homelessness.
Yeah, no, I think that, obviously this this is the challenge that a lot of projects, ultimately, grapple with. But to Dora's point, I consistently think the utilization rate's a big thing. I mean, up and down the state, utilization rates are below 70% in a lot of our housing authorities. And that's because there's just not enough units for tenant voucher holders to go to. So I get and I understand, because I used to sit on that side of the desk, why, the PVBs folks are hesitant, because it further impacts utilization. But ultimately, utilization goes up if we project-based. Likewise, the more units we can just create and accept tenant-based vouchers as well, right? Again, you don't get the same capitalizing, but you can start to factor in a fair market rent over what you would be getting, and then having to put a reserve on, as well, right? So there's just slightly different ways I think we need to continue to really come at this. But I think that the key to me is the one area that there is still tremendous opportunity to tap into that we haven't done yet enough is the housing authorities. Too many times up and down the state, we're talking about projects, and we're talking to cities, and we're talking to counties, we're talking to HUD, we're talking to HCD, we're talking to different folks. But there's a lot of times the housing authorities not at the table, and they don't know about the project. It's not that they wouldn't maybe want to even be involved. They might actually want to be there, but they just don't know. And so I think it's really important to make sure that everyone that has a role to play is there, figure out what works for a particular project. And then over that kind of conversation, we can really start to hammer out and identify where additional gaps in the system are, because I think that we're highlighting some of the issues, but some of these issues might not be the same if we had all of our partners in the room talking about projects.
Thank you. I would list one other potential source for funding for both supportive housing and operating subsidies, and that is this new community care expansion program, which is largely intended for boarding care facilities. But it was the language, thanks to legislative staff, the language that got passed does allow for funding for both supportive housing and for capital and for operating reserves. So I do think, kind of looking under the seat cushions for change, sometimes in the state, there are these programs that are really obscure, we don't know about, and then we can find them by really, trying to change the statutory language around the program or putting in little provisions that help us use some of that funding. So I want to make sure there are no other questions. I don't see any. So I think we will end there. I really appreciate the panelists being on today. I think it was really great discussion, and I hope the audience got something out of it as well. And I hope everybody had a really good conference. Thank you very much for attending. See you all soon.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, everyone.